Thank you so much for the talk, Sue. We have been enraptured with the things that you've talked about. We've been looking at the archaeology, we've been looking at the kind of diagrams that we've seen today, and also some of the archaeology that we've never seen before. We're about to open the floor for question and answers, but before we do, I wanted to ask you a few questions of my own. One of them is, have you heard of a site called Blickmead, which came into focus a while ago with relation to Stonehenge? And specifically the archaeology that came out of it. And a lot of people, archaeologists on the sites included, said this is the reason why Stonehenge existed where it was, because it's a hunting site and the spring never freezes. And you've got other sites such as the Mardenhenge close to also a spring. So what's your take on that? What's your take on Blickmead and the archaeology that came from it?
Yeah, thank you. So Blickmead is a Mesolithic site, so it's really interesting. It has a whole series of what look like quite intense occupation, aurochs bones and flint tools, dating from quite a long different bits of the Mesolithic. And it's one of many, several hunting settlement sites that we have along the upper reaches of the Avon and the Thames. It certainly is an important site. There are also some hunting traps across the Stonehenge area, which date from the same period, where people are digging great big holes for aurochs to fall into. And there are also some pits very close to Stonehenge that date from the Mesolithic period. There is quite a distinct gap between all of that activity and the first Neolithic monuments being constructed. And it has been sort of claimed that this is why Stonehenge is where it is. And I wouldn't, I think, go as far as saying that. There are other also very intensive settlements and hunting places in other parts of southern Britain that don't see the kind of, the arrival of great big monuments. So there's a bit of there's a bit of a gap between the two sites. But it's important to think about one of the reasons why the Stonehenge complex arrives where it is probably because that area is open in terms of the vegetation and the woodland, whereas much of the rest of southern Britain was dense forest at that time. And so that would have made it particularly good for hunting, but that also means it's particularly good for gathering people and building large monuments. So it's one of the reasons that it emerges as an important place.
Also, what do you think about how the Sarsen stone was moved across the landscape? Because there's quite a lot of distance, as you said. I was a while ago, and a while ago, I mean 2017, I was in the area where I was in a place called Lockridge Dean, which supposedly had a lot of Sarsen stone. And allegedly, a lot of it was taken to build the Stonehenge as well. Allegedly, I say. But how do you think people were navigating the landscape in a point in time when all of Britain was so heavily forested and there was potentially no transportation as we see it today?
Yeah, so the Sarsen stones come from about 15 miles to the north of Stonehenge, not far from where you were at Lockridge. We've done some recent geological work, which has pinpointed more specifically an area called Westwoods, where we think quite a lot of the Sarsens come from. It's not a flat journey. It goes down into the Vale of Pewsey and then across quite wet, boggy areas and then back up onto Salisbury Plain. So it's not an easy route to drag the stones. And there would certainly have been, we think they used sledges. They may have used cattle for transport, but it may also have been people. Of course, none of the evidence for this survives because the cradles and any trackways or anything like that have been long, decayed. So we don't know how they did it. My guess is that actually dragging stones on a sledge over grass is pretty. We've done experiments at Stonehenge with visitors and things. You only need 100 or so people or 50 incredibly strong people. We had some rugby teams trying to do it. So it's possible. Over more boggy areas and wet areas, it's more difficult. So you would need to maybe construct a trackway. And ethnographically, we know that that's how stones were moved in places like Indonesia, and some kind of temporary kind of trackway of timbers would have eased the transport of the stones over those kind of areas. The smaller stones, the blue stones, come from southwest Wales. That's a much, much longer journey, 250 kilometres or so. My preference would be for a sea route, that they're actually using boats and rafts to move the stones up the Welsh coast and up the rivers. There's still a bit of overland. But recently, you may have heard that one of the stones at Stonehenge, the altar stone, comes from northeast Scotland, which is even further. So yeah, we have got some really extraordinary feats of moving stones around at that time. And as yet, we don't have really firm answers as to how that was done.
I mean, it's really incredible that people would go to such lengths to just procure the stone to build these monuments. Like you said at the very end, the whole idea of building a monument is almost like trying to show the other people that their culture is supreme, or for that matter, they're going to all these incredible lengths to talk to their gods. One final related question before Simran takes over and runs the Q&A for us, and she's got her own list of questions, as she's told me. So she says, hurry up with this. But I was going through, and this is purely because we met at a theoretical archaeology conference, you and I. I wanted to know how you think Stephen Shannon's theory on demographics in prehistory relates to what's happening at Stonehenge in terms of building the monument, because there's an influx of new people coming in. There's already an existing population following a particular tradition. So how do you think what's going on? Is there any intermingling that you can see? Is there also perhaps some kind of interfusion of the incoming culture and the existing culture? Or is it a gradual assimilation or dissolution of the existing culture with the incoming populations?
Yes. So the question of how many people are living in Britain at this time is really difficult. But answers are now coming, especially from DNA evidence. And it looks like in the Middle Neolithic period, particularly, there's a decline in the numbers of people. And in fact, interestingly, in Northern Europe at that time, around about 2900 BC, there's a large volcanic explosion, which leads to several years of darkness and low temperatures and things. So there's certainly things going on in terms of how people are able to keep, the agriculture going and things like that at the time. So there's certainly decline, and it looks like that in the late Neolithic, the population is not very big, which means that the monument building is even more impressive. The kind of answers for that, I think, will come over the next kind of 10 years or so when we've got more estimates and more detail from the DNA evidence. In terms of assimilation, there is those kind of little blue bars that show that people do come back in. Not only is that shown biologically, but it's also shown in the material culture. So when the beakers get much more varied, it looks like they're incorporating elements of decoration and things which come from the earlier pottery. And also people start to deposit beakers at those earlier big monuments. So there's some continuity in terms of how people are kind of acting. There's also the recurrence of cremation burial. So later on, people start again to cremate their dead. And some people have argued that that's people just continuing all the way through. And then the cremations are actually then incorporated into the barrows and into the kind of more Bronze Age traditions. So there's certainly a melding of different activities that come in. And I think that's visible from about 2100, 2000 BC or so, after we've got these kind of two parallel populations.
Thank you so much for your answers. I will now let Simran take over, and thank you so much for this talk. We've thoroughly enjoyed ourselves. Simran, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for your talk once again. I think all of us thoroughly enjoyed it, and we have so many questions, as you can already see from the chat box as well. So I'll start off with a few questions of mine. Because Stonehenge has been that one site that has captured the imaginations of several people, it has featured profusely in the popular culture as well. So I had a few questions related to that. My first question is, what do you think, or sort of your comments on the collaboration between oral traditions and archaeology, and how at times that has helped in sort of learning a bit more about this site? So for example, for Stonehenge itself, you have so many oral traditions, whether it be Geoffrey of Monmouth writing in 1136 about Merlin and King Arthur and their association with the monument, which now is so substantial, or other accounts, historical accounts mentioning this site in their records as well, or in their memoirs. So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so the Geoffrey of Monmouth story is really interesting. So for those who don't know, Geoffrey of Monmouth was a writer and historian who published a history of Britain, in effect. And in that, he describes how Stonehenge was brought from Ireland by the wizard Merlin to be set as a memorial to the British who had died fighting the Saxons. Now, I mean, Geoffrey of Monmouth was known for being a bit fast and loose with the truth and making up amazing stories. But there may be some elements of truth in that story, in that we do know that the blue stones, come from the west, not necessarily Ireland, but from the far west of Wales in Pembrokeshire, which actually may well have been referred to as Ireland at that time. There were very, similarities across the Irish Sea in terms of the medieval kind of cultures and things. So there's an interesting idea there that they knew that the stones were brought from the west, so that could well have been a preserved memory or story. And so while a lot of the other bits of the monument story, are fairly fantastical, there is that hint that there might be oral traditions that preserve that story. That's really the only one. There are so many stories about Stonehenge, and there are lots of medieval records and manuscript drawings of it. It's one of the monuments that never gets forgotten. Most prehistoric monuments in Britain get rediscovered by antiquarians or even by more modern excavations and things, but Stonehenge never goes out of the imagination, and it gets preserved really well because it's in an area of land that is only really used for pasture. It doesn't really get ploughed. It doesn't get lots of development or settlements later on, so it's well preserved as a kind of landmark, and so it's that kind of familiar and important place, and that's why it's drawn in and described in so many accounts.
Thank you so much for that. I think just sort of carrying on from the last part also, when we're talking about development, and that has featured extensively in our discussions as well, the whole idea of development meeting the present needs of the communities, but also caring for the monuments. So I wanted to know your views on the recent tunnel project, which was recently sort of shelved off as well, and then the reaction of the communities as well, as to some being pro tunnel, some being not pro tunnel. So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so a lot of the discoveries that have been made in the Stonehenge landscape over the last decades have been because of development work. So that new Causeway enclosure at Lark Hill was found because they were building new housing for military. The Amesbury Archer was discovered because of new housing on the edge of the town of Amesbury. So actually, a lot of research results have come from development work, which is great. Those are all, I would say, though, outside the boundary of the World Heritage Site. So they're not very close to the monument of Stonehenge itself. So there is a proposal, there's a major road that goes past Stonehenge called the A303, which is the main link road between London and the southwest. It's a single carriageway road, whereas for the most of its length, it's a dual carriageway. If there wasn't Stonehenge and if there wasn't a World Heritage Site, it would have been made into a dual carriageway decades ago. But it's always been a point of contention because it's so close to the monument. And so to build a dual carriageway would be very intrusive, and it would damage some of the archaeology. And so there's been proposals, many different proposals for tunnels, to put it into a tunnel so that it's out of sight from Stonehenge. Personally, I think putting the road in a tunnel would be great, because we could remove the sight and the sound of the main road from visitors to Stonehenge. You would be able to walk into the southern part of the World Heritage Site, where there are lots of barrow cemeteries and interesting monuments to explore. But I understand also that for local people and for people passing, they see it as a landmark, somewhere that they know and they're familiar with, and not being able to see it is a bit of a blow. So I'm fairly fence-sitting about the tunnel. If the tunnel does go ahead at some point, there'll be, obviously, as part of our planning system here in Britain, very good high quality excavations that will take place, and they will actually answer some of our questions about some of the gaps that we have in our knowledge currently about the area around Stonehenge. So it would be really interesting. At the moment, the scheme that was in place for a few years has been completely shelved. So in some ways, the discussion, it's not going to happen because of the lack of money for the actual project. So unfortunately, that means for local people, they're still stuck in traffic. But it's put the debate on the shelf for now.
Now, that's very true. I still remember back in 2021 when I just started my master's, and this debate was at its all-time high, whether there should be a tunnel or not. And then when I was recently going through the articles, this was completely shelved. And then you again have two contrasting perspectives from the local communities as well, where some local shopkeepers are, a bit frustrated with the traffic that you see here. But then you also see that monument in its sense. And it all sort of boils down to, again, how do different people perceive this monument? And again, where the power really lies um, in terms of deciding what happens and what not. And this brings me to a very sort of much thought about question about the different associations and uses of Stonehenge by different groups of people, specifically the Druids, as we might call them. I remember I was very lucky when I visited Stonehenge around winter solstice in 2023. I actually saw a ritual happening, and it was very interesting the way it was very peacefully conducted. Everyone was happy there. It was contrary to what you are usually told. So I wanted to know, how, again, what are the present sort of measures in place in terms of dealing with pseudo-archaeology? Because you must be getting those visitors as well at the site at all times. And how has a visitor interpretation really changed in terms of sort of dealing with that site? And yeah, so if you just want to answer that first, and then I'll sort of ask my other question.
So many people see Stonehenge as somewhere that's spiritually important to them. There's a whole range of different beliefs. Some might call themselves neo-druids, pagans, Wicca. And this is a series of modern religious beliefs that really stem from the Druids, as in the early 20th century, particularly friendly societies who were sort of like gentlemen's clubs or friendly societies that were set up, and they named themselves after the Iron Age Druids because they thought they were venerable and worthy and wise. And these groups, I mean, initially they would have sort of initiation ceremonies and things. They're a bit like sort of lodges, kind of Freemasons. But they were Christian. They did not believe this as a religion. It was just a sort of orientating kind of device. There's an amazing photograph from 1905 of people at Stonehenge with cotton wool beards and robes, kind of conducting one of these ceremonies. But over time, that has become religious. So the groups of people look back particularly to prehistoric monuments and to nature worship, and they have kind of, I guess, constructed, it sounds awful, but that a belief based on what they think the prehistoric people and believed. And that means that people wish to be at Stonehenge for the solstices and for the equinoxes and other times. This came to, I mean, there's been lots of debate and conflict about this, but since the 1990s, Stonehenge has been open for the solstices for people to come to. It's called Managed Open Access, and there's a round table. So the managers of English Heritage meet regularly with members from the Druid and pagan communities to discuss stone circle access for ceremonies, those kind of things. So it's I wouldn't say it's an easy relationship, but it's one where people get to have their say and are consulted and are involved in the management of the site. So yeah, that's sort of how that stands. In terms of how Stonehenge is presented to the public, up until 2013, it was horrendous. There was a very small car park, and there was no indoor spaces for interpretation or exhibitions. There was nowhere for education groups to meet. There was a small shop that was built in the 1970s and a cafe that was outdoors. It was not fitting for a World Heritage Site. But in 2013, in a project I was involved in when I worked at English Heritage, we built a new visitor centre about a mile away from the monument, so completely out of sight of the site itself, which has an education space, an exhibition space, a cafe and toilets and accessible, everything you would expect for a World Heritage Site. And the exhibition and the interpretation there try to tell the kind of key important aspects of the story of Stonehenge for visitors.
Thank you, Sue. I think I have to say I really enjoyed going through that visitor center when I went to Stonehenge because, again, it sort of put things into perspective and in a nice manner. So even for someone who isn't familiar with the site or has only heard folklores about it, it sort of put the archaeology and the historical context of the site in place in a very nice manner. So I also like that division as well. So it's not really overwhelming to you at the same time that you're seeing it. It also prepares you for that journey to Stonehenge, makes you more excited as well, even.
Mhm.
I even like the fact that at the counter they were even handing you pamphlets
Mhm.
when there was a ritual going around, so you also knew what was happening,
Right.
and that
Yeah.
way even the visitors are respectful towards those traditions instead of there being a potential clash in
Yeah.
case it happens.
It's always really difficult because um, people say, well, why were they allowed to go in the centre, or but it is important to understand that it's not just an archaeological site and that people have really strong beliefs and they view it as a religious site. So it's important to be able to accommodate sort of multiple views and multiple people.
That's very true. So now I'm going to ask questions from the audience because we have a lot of questions from them. The first set of questions is by the Tarak. He asks, while looking at the landscape, do we know about paleo channels of the river Avon and how the Neolithic Bronze Age sites were situated with respect to that?
Yeah, so there's been quite a lot of work done, paleo-environmental work, in looking at the River Avon and how it looked and where it was in the Neolithic. And basically, it's kind of the same as today. It was a bit more braided, a bit more. We know there were lots of reed beds and things like that. In effect, it's the same course as it is today. And the river was obviously really important in the Neolithic period because Stonehenge was connected to it. So they built that avenue, which is a sort of almost like a roadway linking Stonehenge to the river. And also at Durrington Walls, the settlement there, I don't know if you noticed in that reconstruction that I showed, has a sort of little avenue or walkway, roadway running down to the river cliff, where the kind of site is right next to the river. So it's obviously really significant. People have even suggested that people were perhaps burying their dead in rivers at that point. So perhaps there's a funerary aspect to the beliefs and the how people used the river. It also links Stonehenge with kind of the south coast and with communities in the wider area, so it's important in terms of sort of transport and moving people perhaps. How people in that period understood rivers is a really interesting topic. Monument complexes are often located near rivers, and monuments themselves often located in relation to springs. We do know of monument complexes, for example, in Yorkshire, where there's a river called the Gypsy Race, which is a very unusual river in that it disappears underground and it does odd things and it goes around very sharp bends, and it disappears and reappears in a very unpredictable way after rain. And lots of Neolithic monuments were built near to that river. So Neolithic people had a real interest in not only rivers, but kind of interesting things about rivers. So confluences, springs, odd rivers that do funny things, distinct bends in rivers. So the complex in Ireland is built in the bend of the Boyne, the River Boyne, where it has a distinct kind of dog leg and encompasses a little, almost like an island area. There's I wouldn't want to go further than that, but rivers were very, very significant in, I think, both the religious beliefs and the practical lives of the people in the Neolithic period.
Thank you so much. We have another question by Rohini. She says, lovely bird's eye view of the early period surrounding the Stonehenge. My question is, could you locate any manufacturing site for beaker pots? Were these made on wheel or handmade?
These were handmade pots. The wheel doesn't really get used until the Roman period in Britain, so very much handmade. There is, as far as I'm aware, no evidence directly for firing of beaker pots. We know that they're made using local clays, so they're made here rather than being necessarily transported from Europe in the early period. They're using temper, so things like crushed stone and shell and grog, so old pots, to kind of flesh out things. And so sometimes you can look at, so for example, some of the pottery made in the Stonehenge area has shell temper which must come from the coast. But we don't know of any specific manufacturing site, and that's because most of this pottery was just bonfire fired. So the evidence that it would leave behind is not particularly distinctive. You don't have kilns or any structures that relate to pottery manufacture. So as far as I know, we don't have any specific manufacturing sites for beaker pots.
Thank you. We have another question by the Tarak. He asks, for landscape analysis in Salisbury and Dorchester, have viewshed analysis been conducted to understand the intervisibility between contemporary monuments in the landscape?
More so for Stonehenge than for Dorchester. There have been several major landscape studies in the Stonehenge area about visibility. It's a relatively undulating landscape. So there isn't actually, I mean, you can see Stonehenge from some distance away, but there's no intervisibility, for example, between the settlement at Durrington Walls and Stonehenge. It's just slightly over the horizon. For Dorchester, less so, I think, and actually it'd be really interesting to do more studies now that we know the chronology a bit better, because we can kind of imagine, which monuments would be visible and there to be seen at different times. And clearly, the monuments at Maiden Castle, which were on a distinct kind of small rise or ridge, from there you look across the whole of what is now the modern town of Dorchester, but you would have been able to look from there across to see all those monuments that were built in the late Neolithic. So actually I think that's an area for more research to be done.
Thank you. We have a question by Irfan. He asks, can you shed light on the crouched burial practices in Europe and other places these have been found? What cultures are these found with?
So individual burials in crouched positions really come across, it's that Yamnaya spread of people. We know that they often buried their dead in individual graves with grave goods, and particularly under burial mounds. And this is a practice that is also found in Northern Europe in a gets called the corded ware culture. And these again are individual graves with things like pots, stone tools, those kind of things. And it's something that then comes into Britain with the arrival of these new people, or at least a handful of them, and the new practices and things at the beginning of the Early Bronze Age in this Chalcolithic period. So it's certainly something that is not seen in Britain before that. We have very much more communal burials before that, so long barrows, for example, where lots of individuals are buried inside the chambers and get commingled and mixed around, and bones are removed and circulation happens. So it's really only from the early Bronze Age onwards in Britain that we get these crouched burial practices. It's slightly more complicated than that, but that's in essence the corded ware culture is particularly important in understanding individual burials.
Thank you so much. We have one more question, and that's from Anya. She asks, have isotopic studies provided insights into whether livestock was slaughtered at specific times of the year, potentially aligning with seasonal festivals at Stonehenge?
Yes, so it feels like this is a question where somebody knows more than letting on, but yes. So isotope evidence has been really important. So all those hundreds of animal bones that were found at Durrington Walls, the pig and the cattle bones, have been studied quite intensively, looking at the age of the animals when they were killed, and also looking at where those animals were brought up. So isotope analysis allows you to see where the animals are being raised before they're brought to the Stonehenge landscape. And that shows that the pigs and the cattle have been brought over from a variety of different geologies. Some of them are local, some of them have the chalk kind of signature that's local to Stonehenge, but a lot of them come from other parts of Britain, possibly into northern Britain, so quite long distances. One of the things with isotopes is it kind of eliminates areas rather than giving you specific answers as to where animals come from, but certainly it seems that they're coming over long distances, so perhaps people are bringing contributions to the feast from their home communities. It also shows that there's a peak of the kill pattern which is around 9 months old. Not all of them, but quite a majority of the pigs are killed at around 9 months. And if we think that pigs are being farrowed or born in the spring, that suggests that we've got a peak of feasting happening around midwinter. Now that would happen anyway, because you would slaughter your animals at the right kind of age in order to have the large animals but not feed them for too long. And also winter is a good time because you can it's cold and meat will last longer, etc., etc. But it has been interpreted that this peak in the feasting is around midwinter, and that aligns with what we know about Stonehenge being aligned on the midwinter solstice. And so it suggests that people are getting together and gathering and feasting around that time.
Thank you so much, Sue. I think we are at an end of our Q&A session. And I feel like, again, we have so many questions, so many things to discuss, and that's just a testament to how wonderful the lecture was and how all of us thoroughly enjoyed it. I know for a fact that I'm going to discuss it a bit more when we meet again. But thank you so much, Sue, for doing this and for delivering your lecture today. We're really grateful.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming along and doing this for such a long time. I think we've taken almost all of your Saturday in this lecture today, and we're nowhere close to done. And I have to admit, I'm a bit jealous Simran gets a one-on-one with you more often than we would. And yes, we would love to hear more from you, specifically with respect to the other monuments you've worked on as well, because this is something that we don't really hear about so much. These are popular monuments. People know about them all around the world, the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, most of them, but people know very little about them. And having been to these as a young archaeologist myself, right after I'd graduated, has made a significant impact in the way that I look at prehistory, because I specialize in prehistory myself. So I sort of look at it in a very different way now because of being to these monuments, because of the visitor experiences that they provide, and also because of the way the research, the archaeological research, has been done on them, as opposed to just focusing on maybe just one aspect, or the art historic or the oral aspect of what traditions were. So thank you so much for your talk today. And to everybody joining in, thank you so much for coming in. I think there was no better way of celebrating International Women's Day than have a female archaeologist talk about a site to all of you. We do talk with an expert sessions almost every Saturday. If you're with us, we will let you know through the same channels that you've registered for this talk for about what the next session will be and when it will be held. Thank you so much for being a part of us today. And with that, we conclude the session. Thank you very much. Thanks once again, Sue.